What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Veronica. We discuss lifestyle and mental health on this channel. Right now, you guys are watching a part of my interview with a life coach podcast series. We have a very special guest with us today, Jay Lewis. Jay is a grief coach. Jay, welcome in. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Again, thank you for having me, Veronica. Seriously, let me tell you something. What you're doing is incredibly important. And, you know, having that, having a space for people to be able to feel comfortable about addressing their mental health and with life coaches now really focusing on their emotional health. It's what's interesting is we want to put everything into a mental category. And, which again, there's a large circumstance to be said, but many circumstances begin as an emotional element and manifest into a mental element. For instance, you're going through a bad breakup, you get a divorce or something like that. That is the heart. But over the course of time, it becomes a mental issue, especially because society says, look, man, just go get some therapy. You'll be all right. So now you misconstrued an emotional issue with a mental issue. And because they're so interlinked,
It can be
you yeah, it gets interesting.
difficult. I did want to I did want to ask you a little bit about that today. I know a lot of people might be watching this podcast and they've never heard of a grief coach before. They've heard of a therapist, but they're not familiar with grief coaching. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences between a grief coach and a therapist?
Yes. One, a grief coach is not well, this grief coach, I'll say that, is is not you don't have the acumen of, say, a therapist or an education of a therapist in that respect. More importantly, life coaches, whether it's a grief coach or a business coach, whatever frame of niche you're in, we're designing to move a person forward. A therapist, counselor, they're educated on making sure that they can find ways to address your past and explain it to your present, and with the help of getting to your future. Coaches don't focus on your past. Coaches focus on addressing the present to create a way forward. So that is, in a nutshell, I think that's kind of the biggest difference between a therapist and a coach. And a grief coach is just a person that addresses grief and uses grief to create that understanding of the fact that you have the ability to move forward.
Beautiful. Thank you. Um, so just recognizing the fact that something happened to trigger
Absolutely.
this feeling of grief and to help the person to move forward in spite of it or
And
with
and
it.
that's really what it is. I mean, the one thing is, seriously, um, whatever has occurred in your past is clearly a challenge, clearly. And you don't take anything away from that at all. What a life coach wants to do, though, is to say, we recognize that you've gone through something. We recognize it was difficult, but we can't go back to figure out how to unravel that. For instance, I tell my clients all the time that once you break an egg and you start mixing it, you cannot unscramble that. So You can you can choose to keep it how it is, or you can choose to put in a frying pan and make an incredible omelet out of it. It's up to you. The omelet represents moving forward. The egg in a bowl represents the fact that unless you decide on eating an egg undercooked, that's probably not the best course of action. So that's a
That's,
visual, of someone understanding that aspect of things.
I like that analogy. Like something happens in the past and that's where it stays.
Right.
You can't go back in time and change what happened. I did want to ask you too, in reference to the 5 stages of grief. I know a lot of us have heard about those 5 stages, like denial, bargaining, depression, anger, acceptance. What are some of the other things that people deal with in terms of grief that you help them navigate through? Like someone passes away or they're grieving the loss of a job or the loss of a relationship, and so they start to stress eat or stress spend, um, or the relationships that they have with other people after that loss become affected. How do you help them navigate through that?
Well, the first thing I wanted to do is I want to start by acknowledging one thing. The first, the stages of grief. Now, the 5 stages of grief, that is actually for the person going through the circumstance. And the person witnessing it is they're not really subject to those particular 5 stages of grief. They just go through a mourning period or a grieving period time frame. But to answer your question, moving forward is the only thing that can be done to address uh, some circumstance that may have created some emotional that even eventually goes to a mental issue. It's I tell people all the time, you have a choice. Your choice is to continue to live the situation that is causing you the grief. Every day, bring it up. Every day, go about thinking about it every day. Or find the best ways to memorialize that circumstance. When I say memorialize, say it's happened. I cannot go back. But what can I learn from it? And the learning is what creates somewhat an honor, a memorialization. Because if, for instance, say your parent passed, you can't do anything about that fact.
Mhm.
But what you can do is look at the incredible amount of time that you spent together. Take a look at the incredible lessons that they've taught you, the lessons that you may pass to your family. And all those things now become a memorial, an honoring of the person that has passed. It's no longer you feeling like you're a victim of the loss. The loss may have victimized you, but you are not a victim. You're only a victim if you decide that was my initial thing. Choose. If you choose to be in a circumstance, then you have to understand that you're asking for the result to be a challenge. You
I,
know, because you can't expect the result to be different. Knowing that this thing has happened, knowing that you're going to miss. this person, knowing that you may have you may have gone through a divorce and that lifestyle's now changed. You know, whatever the pain is, you have a choice to say to yourself, I wish it was like how it was the day before I knew about the pain.
Mhm.
Or you can say, you know what? The pain's here. Now I need to figure out how to walk through it, still figure out how to maintain moving forward and keep myself on point. Because again, all these different forms of grief, they're going to change it. Whatever the situation is. You know, a person whose child has left to go to college,
Mm.
that's a different type of pain than a person who may have lost a child. Two different types of pain. So now each one has to be addressed in a different situation. But the empathy
I
is
love
really what
that.
can't be lost. Of course, it's not the same amount of empathy when your child goes away to school versus, but it's still, there's a lot of empathy there.
Mhm.
I mean, I know I had that conversation with a friend of mine just recently. Um, his daughter ended up going to my alma mater, and my daughter also went to my alma mater. He was prodding and poking both of us. Like he was like, so, how was it back in the day? Oh, how was it when, it's my daughter, she just graduated maybe 3 years ago, just left 3 years ago. So of course he wanted to hear more from her, to find out what was going on. But it's interesting because, you know, a parent, we have been guardians of our children for since they were 17, 18. And now, you know, we're going to still be guardians, but now we're going to be guardians from a long distance. And it's for parents tackling that, that's interesting. And again, I'm just using that as an example, but that's one form of, of grief. That's a form that a lot of people probably don't even realize is ends up being a point of pain until maybe 2 months down the road and you walk into the room and they're not there.
Yes. I love how you mention it that way that as a coach, you make a conscious effort to put yourself in the shoes of the client, and that no matter what type of grief they're dealing with, it's a pain point for that person. And then, too, when you mentioned uh, the way that we process grief might be different for person to person depending on what we're going through, but that process is still a choice. And like one way, oh, bless you,
Excuse
sorry.
me.
That that one way that you recommend for people to process their grief in a healthy way is to memorialize the time spent with that person, like the good memories that they shared with that person. I think that's so powerful because so often we find someone that passes away and or we lose a relationship with a significant other and we're just eating all the time because we don't want to think about it. We don't want to deal with it. But what you're saying is ultimately we do end up dealing with it in a toxic way and you help people to deal with that uh, in a way that is productive and healthy so they can move forward.